Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, 2021 Delaware Legislative Updates. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. All attendees are in listen-only mode. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will try our best to address a select few during the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded. A copy of the audio recording and PowerPoint slides will be emailed to you within 24 hours of the completion of this live presentation. I would now like to pass it over to Chad Toms. Chad?
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks everyone for joining us. I know we pulled this together on a fairly short time frame, and what we were thinking for today's presentation was I was just going to put together some slides that kind of run through the changes that we sent out on our firm update, and then take some questions. So if you have questions, throw them in the chat box. We'll try to cover them as we go. And then, of course, if there's questions afterwards, happy to have anybody call us. I think we sent out this notice to all of our clients. So let me kind of run through some of these slides. So the first slide I have, this is really driven by House Bill 112. It was just signed by the governor on September 20th, which is going to make it effective on October 20th. But don't think this is something that just happened. In fact, I went back through my notes to kind of look at where this started. And what's pretty interesting is I have notes going back to 2017, where on the committee for the Common Interest Community Ombudsman Legislative Committee, we started talking about some of these changes. And the way it started was there was a cleanup bill that some of the individuals that were involved when the Kiowa was adopted, just sending around some typo changes or corrections. Hey, we missed a comma here. And that was kind of the beginning in 2017. And what the catalyst was is somewhere around 2018, a bill got introduced by a legislator that was going to significantly modify the resale disclosures and the penalties involved for resale disclosure. We're going to talk about that. But it was very punitive, and that kind of really engaged the committee that I'm on for the Ombudsman, and we essentially kind of asked the legislators if we could take a shot at making a number of changes. So let's take that one change, see if we can address it, as well as take some of these cleanup issues. And so what happens, we put together kind of a laundry list. We invited anyone to send us, our committee, the list of, well, what would you like to see change? What are some of the problems? And we put together a fairly long list. We then circulated that list to the realtors, the home builders, to attorneys that practiced in this area. And we solicited comments back. And surprisingly, we got a lot of comments back of opposition to some of the changes. So we essentially took the list, our long list, and broke it up into two categories. One was the things we considered somewhat non-controversial, the types of things that most groups could get behind and support. And then there was the list of the controversial things. So the list that you're seeing in House Bill 112 was essentially what we considered to be the non-controversial stuff that got introduced, and it took a couple years to work its way through the legislature and ultimately became House Bill 112. I also still have a list of these controversial issues that we may actually bring to the forefront over the next couple of years and work on. So stay tuned. There might be some more coming. But let's talk a little bit about House Bill 112 and what it's going to mean for you. So it does do a number of typographical or corrections, and I'll highlight those for you. But it also makes a number of changes to Kiowa, the Common Interest Ownership Act, which was adopted in 2009, and it makes one change to the Unit Property Act. And what we're going to do, it has a number of sections. And so when we sent the link out to the bill, each bill has a section which changes. So I'm going to have a slide for each section just so we can kind of work through it that way. But just so that you know, we had that link. You can click on the bill itself, which will show you the actual changes to the code, as well as there's a summary page for some of those changes. So let's kind of get into those, and I'll be looking for questions as we go through it. And what I'm going to try to do is have, a slide that either covers one or two or each one of those sections, and I'm kind of group them by what they are. So the first section 1, and when I put section 1, essentially if you go to the bill, each change will be labeled section 1 or section 2. So what my slides are is they should correspond with the sections. So Section 1 is really just a typo change. There was a reference in the provision that did not include the word not. As you might imagine, that actually changes the meaning substantially, so that got corrected. I would not consider that too controversial. Section number 2 is somewhat similar. It was also a cleanup provision that it had to make clear that this section was not intended to apply to non-residential common interest communities. So, for example, office building condominiums, those types of things. And so I don't believe that Section 1 or 2 was really controversial. It was one of those what we consider to be one of those original cleanup doctrines. But Section 3, this is kind of where things start to become really interesting, and they really are going to change the landscape a little bit for us. So what are the major things that this Section 3 does? Section 3 changes Section 81-119 of the Iowa statute. So for those of you that use that statute from time to time, that is the place where it talks about if you are a pre-existing community that existed prior to the adoption of Iowa in 2009, what sections of the code actually apply to you. So why do changes to this section become important? Well, they become important because now there's 5 new sections that previously did not apply to you if you were a pre-existing community that now, when this bill becomes effective, will apply to you on a go-forward basis. And I'm going to have a slide. We're going to kick through those and so you can see what each one of those looks like. But there was one other pretty interesting change that I wanted to highlight for you. And let me put it on the screen just so you can kind of see where that change is. So this is a copy of the bill. This here is Section 3. Hopefully you can see it okay. I understand it's probably a little small, but if you get a copy of the bill in front of you and you look at Section 3, what you'll have is the top section. I'm putting my cursor slightly above it. You'll see where some new provisions were added. For example, 217I, I'm going to talk about that later, 306, 308A. So you can see that, all right? So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But drop down to this portion on the bottom of the screen where it says, with respect, and you'll see the addition of a new phrase, all common interest communities, and you'll see stricken out the word condominiums and cooperatives. And this is something that was, we talked about a lot in representing community associations the last number of years, which was if there's a conflict between your pre-existing documents and the new code, well, what controls? And the express language of the Iowa when it was adopted here in 2009 for this particular section made clear that as to a condominium and a co-op, the pre-existing documents controlled in the place of a conflict. But it was silent as to how it would be handled for other, for example, HOAs or maintenance corporations. And there was a lot of debate as to whether it was intended or not intended. And so to avoid litigation, the legislature has now spoken on this issue, meaning we've asked them to kind of give us direction. And what the direction was is that this should have applied, this or now will apply to all common interest communities. So if there's a conflict between pre-existing documents and the statute, the pre-existing documents will control. So that's a change. That's of importance. I'm going to now slide that off my screen. All right. And so let's talk about those 5 provisions. So I'm going to have a slide where we're going to work through some of these. I'm going to have a separate slide for the bottom 4. But as to the top one, 81-217I, the reason that this change was made is a number of communities governing documents require that for an amendment to have effect, that you obtain consent from the mortgage holders, so the mortgage companies. As you might imagine, that is not an easy task to do. And so the language of Iowa, and this language, 217I, existed before, but it only applied to new communities going forward, allowed for what I would describe as a negative approval process, meaning you mail out the change to the mortgage companies and wait for them to object. And if they do not object, you deem it approved. So this provision now will apply backwards to pre-existing communities. So that's 217I. That'll be very helpful. I know I have a number of clients that have been waiting for that provision to be effective for them. So let's start to work through some of the other changes. So 81-306 previously was not applicable to pre-existing communities. Well, it will be now. Well, what are some of the things in this statute that, in this particular provision, that we need to deal with? Well, in that particular provision, it says that your bylaws must, and it has a number of provisions that need to be in your bylaws. And I've listed them here, and they have things such as the number of board members, the election of officers, how things, vacancies are filled, how you amendments. And note that this particular section of the statute does not necessarily tell you exactly what the number should be or how that provision should read. It's just saying that your bylaws need to have these things. So as a result of that, if you're pre-existing communities, we're encouraging you to go back, look at your bylaws. If they don't have these things, you're going to want to make sure that you make an attempt to amend your bylaws to add those types of things. So something for you to take a look at, go back and review. There's also an interesting provision in 306 that I think is somewhat helpful. It didn't apply to pre-existing communities before. And what it does is your bylaws can actually require a unit owner to designate the association to receive notice of termination of utility services. Well, why is that important? Well, so imagine in a condominium setting and freezing temperatures, if somebody's electric is off or the gas is off, we know that means there's no heat. And if there's a risk of water freezing, causing flooding, the association wants to know about that and they can take action. So this provision is there to allow an association in those circumstances where it really needs to know that part of information to be designated to be advised of termination of certain utility services. So something to be aware of. There's some benefits. There's also some detriments in this for pre-existing communities. So that's section 306. So let's move on. 308A, this is probably the section that's going to cause a lot of either happy folks or unhappy folks, really depending on how you look at it. So 308A deals with executive board meetings. It is most commonly cited as the section that requires open board meetings, that owners can attend your open board meetings. Now, there's a lot more in this section than just that, so let's kind of work through this, keeping in mind. So now this is going to be applicable to pre-existing communities. Well, so what's in there? Well, that section requires at least quarterly meetings. So if you're only having a meeting twice a year for your boards, you're now going to be required to at least have quarterly meetings. It's also going to define what is a meeting, meaning does the joining together of more than two of your board members in a social setting constitute a meeting. And there's a provision in there that pretty much says, no, that's not really how it works, but you have to make sure that you're not discussing business or discussing issues of the board or conducting business. So what are some of the other things in there? Well, one of the other provisions is related to notice. Notice of these meetings have to be at least 10 days, but no more than 60 days before the meeting. There's a requirement in this section that the agenda for the meeting be published and that they give unit owners an opportunity to speak at meetings. And as to the open meeting, and I spend a lot of time talking with clients about this, is, well, when can we close the meeting for private discussions? And 308A has a section that talks about, well, for what reasons can an association typically go into a private session, exclude members from the discussion? And that's where that's in this section. So I've put them on the screen here. Here's your typical list, which is consultation with legal counsel or, and this is a little bit broader than the Unit Property Act, a discussion of legal litigation, mediation, or arbitration, really ongoing litigation matters. The second category is labor or personnel, meaning like our employee issues. Those can typically be done in a closed session. The third item is contract negotiations, and it's particularly like when you have competitive bids and you're fearful that if information about the bids can get out, it could adversely affect the association. So, for example, if one person knows what the other person bid, they may want to try to modify or undercut. Those are the types of things that you can go into executive session for. And the last one, this is kind of like a little bit more broad category, is the board for the discussion of any complaint or violations related to a unit owner. And this is the important part, when the board determines that knowledge would violate the privacy of the unit owner. And so keep in mind, these are all things that the board can go into executive session for. It's not a requirement that you go into executive session. And we typically recommend as a best practice that when you move into executive session, the minutes from your regular meeting will show one particular board member made a motion to go into an executive session to discuss a particular item of business. That motion then received a second, and it was either approved by a majority vote, and then the body went into executive session. Then usually your minutes the next will reflect when the body came out of the executive session. So essentially it would say at 5:06 we went into executive session for these purposes, and we came out of executive session at 5:46, something along those lines. And I often get asked whether or not there's a requirement for minutes of executive session. There is not, but a lot of communities do choose to keep minutes for those meetings, and we always recommend that you keep them completely separate from minutes of your regular meeting. I see a question in the chat box, and it is something I kind of had in one of the slides, but I kind of went over it very quickly. The question is, if you post the calendar meetings, and I apologize, I forgot to turn my cell phone on to vibrate right before the seminar. If you post the meeting calendar at the beginning of the year, are you obligated to send out notice? And that's a really good question. And the answer is no, you're not. So what happens is you have the power now to either post a schedule. The meetings are going to occur on such and such a date, on such and such a place, the fifth Tuesday of every other month, and you can have the agenda attached as to what will be covered in those meetings. And by doing that, you don't now have to send out notice of each and every meeting as they come due. So good question. Sorry, I kind of cruised over that in the slides, but I think it was in my fourth bullet point down that, I think it was my fourth. But it's definitely something that is allowed now under this 308A. So there's a lot of other things in this particular section. So let me just move on to that other slide there. So what else is in there? So the executive board's allowed to meet by telephone or by video, and this provision of the statute provides, well, how are they allowed to do that? Well, as long as the meeting notice provides for that information, and you have to give your owners an opportunity to hear the discussion and offer comment. So it's essentially very similar to what the Delaware statute provides, which is to be present at a meeting for a Delaware corporation, you have to be able to hear and be heard. So that's incorporated within that particular provision. Finally, there's towards the end of that 308A, there's a section that talks about unanimous written consent. And unanimous written consent is a concept that associations use very frequently, which is it's a process by which the board can act without getting together in a meeting, whether it be virtual or by in person. The process is if all of your members agree to a particular action, you can execute it by unanimous consent instead of actually having a meeting. And the important thing to note is you're using the word unanimous in that situation. If one board member or two board members disagree and you don't have unanimity, that triggers the need to have a meeting. And at that meeting, you'll discuss the issues and have a motion and vote. But if everybody can agree on a particular issue, you can do it by written consent. You circulate a document that everyone signs. And this section says you can do that for just about any act except for, and it gives you a list of things that you can't do by written consent. One is adopt a rule, budget, or special assessment. You can understand that those are fairly important things. Number two is impose a fine or take some sort of enforcement action. Again, the code wants you to get together and talk about those things, not just do them by written consent. Buy or sell real estate, borrow money, or to enter into a contract over a certain dollar amount, which is essentially 1% of the annual budget. So those are the types of things that you can't do by written consent, but everything else you would be allowed to do by written consent. And there's one other thing in this section 308 that I think is very helpful, and you should be aware of it going forward and try to utilize it, which is there's a provision in there that limits the challenge to board's actions to 60 days if minutes are approved and distributed. So what happens is if boards are not approving their minutes and they just kind of hang out there, the decisions made in those meetings can be challenged for long periods of time. But the statute says, look, if you're operating quickly, you're getting your minutes done and approved at the next meeting and out the door, we're going to give you the benefit of that, and we're going to start to limit the ability of owners to challenge those actions to a certain time period once they got notice of the minutes. So that's some of the things that are in 308A that's I think are very helpful. I've got another question here in the chat box. It says, should it be done at the conclusion of board meetings agenda, or should meetings be adjourned and then hold Q&A? Also, is a Q&A required to be in a minute? So I think this question relates to essentially the owner comment. And so I'll just I don't have a slide on this, but I talk often about board meetings and owner comments. So this particular provision does require a section in a executive board meeting where owners can offer comments to the board. And I always say first, comment just means the board has to listen to you and take in those comments. They're not obligated to answer questions or be cross-examined about a particular issue. And then the question is, well, when do we do it? Do we want to do it at the front of the meeting? Do we want to do it at the back of the meeting? Well, I always say, board, it's your meeting. You've got to conduct your business. If you want to allow owners to talk on the front end, that's your choice. If you want to wait, put all those owner comment at the back end, that's fine. There's typically some sort of limitation, 2 minutes. You can only speak once. But I say there's no right or wrong answer so long as you do give owners the opportunity to speak. Some communities, boards choose to allow owners to give comments throughout the meeting on particular topics. I mean, they must enjoy having long meetings is all I can figure, but that's definitely an option. So there's no right or wrong as to the front end or the back end as long as you do allow that to happen. So somebody has put another question here, and that says, well, how does this affect board working sessions? And so I'll hop up on my soapbox. Working sessions is not a word that you're going to, or a phrase you're going to find in this statute. So I know people use that phrase all the time, but I'm going to tell you it's not defined. And so as a result of it, I discourage boards from using the term working sessions. If you look at Robert's rules, what a working session is truly intended to be is that a certain amount of the board directors get together solely for the purpose of organizing information so that it can be presented to the entire board. Right? So the purpose is, let's say there's 2 or 3 of the financial folks want to get together and help put together the slides for the budget so that we can present it in an orderly fashion. That's really what a working session is for. How have I seen working sessions used? Well, I've seen labels slapped on meetings where the entire board gets together and pre-decides everything ahead of time, only to then have a board meeting where the decisions have already been made and owners have not gotten an opportunity to watch the back and forth dialogue. So I'm going to warn those folks here on our call, please be careful about using working sessions or calling things working sessions because it could potentially violate the open meeting requirements. Oh, here's another good question from the chat box. Can board meeting minutes be posted in draft form after meetings and then when approved, posted in final? Now, the way the question was phrased is, can the board do this? And the answer is yes, the board can do it. But just because you can do it doesn't mean that you should do it. And we typically recommend that board minutes do not be distributed or posted in a draft form, that only when they're final do they become posted and available to members. And in fact, there's another provision in the Iowa statute that states that a board is not obligated to produce minutes in draft. It's only obligated to produce minutes once they're final. And this could be dangerous. You don't want to put things in draft minutes that ultimately aren't necessarily accurate. All right, so let's move on a little bit. All right, one of the other sections that is now applicable to pre-existing communities, and this is, I think, going to be very helpful, is Section 310. Section 310 has some really helpful provisions about voting and proxy. So I've got kind of 2 slides on it. So what does it do? There's a provision that talks about when you have multiple owners, how do you handle that? Who can vote for it? Okay, no problem, very helpful. It makes clear proxy voting is allowed. I sometimes get questions like this. It addresses, well, are lessees allowed to vote? What happens if the association itself owns some of the lots, which does happen from time to time? Gosh, I apologize. I really should have shut down all my telephones. And then there's also a discussion about, well, what happens in a general routine meeting? The majority controls once quorum is present. So that's kind of some of the preliminary stuff in 310, very helpful. It's the type of thing that's typically would have been addressed in your bylaws anyway. But this section also has some really helpful information that you're going to want to utilize going forward. And I'm going to have a second slide later because one of the other sections actually tweaks Section 310. So I'm giving you a slide on what the old Section 310 is, but then we're going to have one more modification to it. So here's a provision I like very much about 310. I believe it's Subsection F. And what it talks about is, well, how can I accomplish a vote if we don't have a meeting? And so pre this change, I'm constantly talking about, okay, are we going to have a vote at a meeting, and how are we going to run the meeting? How are we going to tabulate the votes? Or are we going to vote outside the confines of the meeting? And you can't cross-pollinate those concepts because a proxy is only for voting at a meeting that you can't attend, and the word proxy would not really come into play if you're voting outside the confines of a meeting. So try to keep those concepts separate. And then what Section 310F talks about, well, if you're going to take a vote outside of a meeting, so we're not going to get the other in the room, and I'm not going to allow all the individuals to try to convince me which way to vote, and there's no discussion on a particular topic. This particular statute says, well, what do you have to do? Well, you have to tell people and disclose a certain amount of information. And it says something such as, and I've listed them here, you got to list the number of responses needed for quorum. You've got to talk about the percentages of approval that are necessary. You have to specify, well, where do you drop your ballot off? When does it have to be received? And here's the real kicker that catches people the most is you also have to describe the procedures upon which when a unit owner is wishing to deliver information to other unit owners. And essentially that replaces the ability for a unit owner to stand up at a meeting and say, well, I think the body should not vote for this because of X, or I think the body should vote for it, I support it. So essentially you're taking that ability to debate and discuss a matter, and you're putting it into the hands of your owners to say, look, if you want to exchange information with your unit owners, here's how you do it. And it's either here's all the addresses to send letters, here's the emails if you want, or here's how you post it onto a website for a discussion board. But if you're going to now vote outside the confines of a meeting, you kind of have to work through these issues. And the provision makes sure that this is valid so long as you follow these procedures, you get the appropriate number of votes needed, and assuming you had needed quorum, you hit the quorum with the total number of votes. And there's one other little interesting provision here in 310 is that under this mail, I call it a mail-in ballot. Most of the time it's mail-in, but we're going to get to, does it really have to be mail or can we do an email? I'll get to that in a second. But once the ballot's received, there's some real limitations on the ability of it to be revoked or changed. Okay. So I'm still under Section 3. I know we've been talking about it for a long time, but what's one of the other sections that got added under this provision? And it's surplus funds, 314. And this is a pretty interesting one, and really what it says in shorthand term is that an association has surplus funds. It either has to give the money back to its owners, or it has to then apply it as a credit going forward. And this is probably going to give people a lot of concern. Well, what do I do with all this extra cash? Do I really have to refund it? And I've highlighted, or at least I've underlined some of the language I think is really important when I talk to my clients about this, which is you can prepay reserves. And it doesn't use the word capital replacement reserve. It just says reserve. So that's any kind of reserve. So for example, contingency reserve, working capital reserve, snow plow reserves, and my personal favorite, legal expense reserves. So you can create all sorts of reserves to set money and fund those reserves. And only once you've reached the level to fund all of those reserves do you then step into this obligation to either give the money back or apply it as a credit to the future. So that's a provision that you're going to be probably grappling with going forward if you're a pre-existing community that didn't previously have to deal with that. I'm finally done with Section 3. There was a lot of stuff in there. So we should be able to move pretty quickly through here. So just so that you know, so Section 4, it was clarified a common interest ability to amend its governing documents. And you'll recognize 81-217I. It's really close to that other section we related to with the mortgage companies earlier. Also, Section 5 added a new section for 217, and this is really just to allow declarants to make typographical corrections or mistakes in the documents, and that's a provision that was in the original uniform code that just didn't make it into our code. So it made sense that way. If declarants made typographical errors, they could correct it. Now, is there a risk that declarants can use this for non-typographical errors? Yeah, of course it is, and I guess we'll potentially see where that takes us in the future. All right, so Section 6, this is section, amends 303A to clarify what is the duty for fiduciary standard. And his is just one of the problems where we took the uniform code and we took its language and we dropped it in the statute and adopted it, and we didn't really correct it for what Delaware. In Delaware, unlike most states, the corporate code is the same for-profit corporations and not-for-profit corporations, whereas in most states, there's a separate code for for-profit corporations and one for not-for-profits, and they have different standards. So here in Delaware, because the standard is the same, we just clarified the language and just said the standard is the same for both. Section 7 is there's an amendment to 303C. This allows for a termination of the declarant control period as permitted in the document. Now, this applies only to post-DeKiowa created communities. So what it says is if it was allowed under DeKiowa and it was put into the documents will control. All right. So let's move on to Section 8. And this is one of the ones where I think this is going to be very helpful. And this is a change that relates to voting and is trying to modernize the ability to vote. So we're getting away from do I got to sign a piece of paper and mail it in with a proxy, and I've spent a lot of time drafting proxy forms for folks. So what does this change do? Well, this change really kind of expands the options for voting. What does it allow? Well, of course, in-person voting is still allowed. Proxy voting is still allowed. But here's where it starts to get really interesting. Electronic voting from a known source, such as an email address registered with the association. Wow. That's broad. So that's really giving us the power to start collecting people's votes so that they send them in by email. So that's going to be a very helpful provision. It allows us to use electronic voting software. How about just a signed petition? So that's also an expansion of being able to collect somebody's vote that way. It also makes clear signatures can be by ink, they can be by electronic, and then it talks about that an entity or trust can designate a person for voting. So that change is really going to add some flexibility on a go-forward basis. So I'm cruising right along. We don't have too much more. Section 9 amends Section 81.316. It really just adds language that allows an association to charge a reasonable fee for certifications. Just clarified that one issue. Section number 10, just a correction through a comma in there. I put it in the slides just so that we kind of follow the progression, but I don't think that's anybody's too worried about that comma that was missing. Section 11 also added language related to that the association essentially can charge the fee on the front end before an owner can demand copies of books and records. In the past, it was almost owners would demand the records and say, yeah, sure, I'll pay you. And then the association had to chase them down to get paid. So it makes it clear on the front end they can charge that. Section 12, this is one of the other changes that I used to spend a lot of time talking to owners about. Section 81.324A talks about the budget adoption process, and this will now allow the budget adoption to be clear that you can submit your vote by proxy. In the past, there was some argument that you had to show up in person, but this is now clear. You either vote in person or by proxy. All right, and then the last two changes are some of the more important ones, at least more important, but a little bit more controversial. So Section 13 changes Section 81.408, which is really the purchaser's right to cancel after receiving the public offering or disclosure package. So this really only is between declarants selling new property and homeowners purchasing new property. But this is one where the Real Estate Commission back and forth. And essentially, they kind of landed on language that it wasn't working before, that an owner had 15 days to cancel. So they kind of bifurcated and said, look, that if you get the public offering statement at least 5 days before your contract, you're really limited on your ability to cancel. But if you don't get the public offering statement until on or after you sign your contract, you get 5 days to cancel afterwards. So they kind of clarified that language, and they said it made it a little bit more workable for the sales office people to actually be able to manage that process. So that's 13. And then 14 is one of the more controversial ones too. This is the one that I think the original bill back in 2018 kind of got us talking about, in that there was an attempt to put some real teeth into the statute for mistakes, resale in statements. So I've copied the language, that the final version that ended up through the bill, which is that, and there's two sentences here you need to focus on. The first sentence is related to the association. The second one is related to professional management companies. And the first sentence says that really, unless it's fraud, gross negligent, or reckless or willful misconduct, the association is only liable to owner for the amount of money that it collected. So if it collected $100 to give you a resale certificate and it was wrong, and you relied upon it and you were damaged, the most of your damages you can go to the association for is what you paid for the resale packet. But the second sentence is where the teeth kind of lies and where some of the controversy comes in, and it makes clear that that limitation does not apply to the managing agent. And so I know that for our managing agents, that to the extent they do the resale certificate preparation, they're modifying the way they handle and do things as a result of some of those changes. So that's it for House Bill 112. I've got one more slide I wanted to show, and I see I got one more question here in the chat box. Is there any provision that adjusts the fees that can be charged for Kiowa forms? And no, I don't think the dollar amount has changed, if that was a question. So there's one other bill out there pending right now that might get some traction, and it relates to a very politically driven issue in the Middletown area. If you've read any of the articles about the flagpole and the eagle, what's now pending in Senate Bill number 170, which, whether it passes or not, at least I thought I'd warn everybody about it. It essentially is going to expand the power of an homeowner to install a flagpole in their lot. So what you see ahead of you is proposed changes to Section 81.316. This provision really only allowed flagpoles to stand when they were installed by a developer prior to transition. By the eliminations you see here, it would essentially eliminate that connection to the developer prior to transition and do allow owners to really deal with install flagpoles in the yard. So this is pending, may or may not pass next year, but I just thought you'd at least know about it while we were talking about the legislative things. So with that, we're slightly past the half an hour. Let me see if there's any other questions in the chat box. Nope, I don't think so. So that's very good. So I want to thank everyone very much for their time. And Rachel, I think I could throw it back to you for your closing comments.
Yes, thanks, Chad. And thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. And as a reminder, a copy of the slide deck and link to the recorded presentation will be circulated to the group within the next 24 hours. On behalf of all of us at Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston, stay well.